Welcome everyone to this first ever podcast of Tarih-i Sahir, Orphic History. I'm Murat Devres, and in front of me is Adam Nichols. I'm going to start this podcast by presenting who I am. I'm a PhD historian. I was educated at the ULB in Belgium, Brussels, and the Bosphorus University in Istanbul. Although my main topic is contemporary Turkish history and Republican history, I find the topic of pirates fascinating. And as a precarious historian, I'm trying to do some public history as well. This is what I'm trying to accomplish in this modest YouTube channel. And as we were entering the 2025 summer season, I wanted to concentrate a bit on the topic of pirates. And during my research, I came across Murat Reis, which in Turkish is known as the Little Murat Reis, Küçük Murat Reis, a Dutch convert to Islam who was infamous in the North Atlantic through his raids to Iceland, most particularly, but also England and Ireland. In my research, I encountered Dear Adam's blog, which I would like to share with you very briefly. Corsairs and Captives is the best website I came across during my research on the topic of the pirates of the Mediterranean, as I came to know them, the Barbary Coast pirates. And it is the reference site to go to when you want to research a bit more on the topic of the Barbary Corsairs. This is how I encountered Adam's work, and I just wrote him a modest email, and he was so generous to reply to me, and we got to talking, and we decided to make this podcast for you to perhaps enjoy and learn from. And I would like to tell you a bit about Adam's bio. So he was born in England, grew up in Montreal. So we share a French-speaking past in Canada. He was an associated professor with the University of Maryland for nearly 40 years. He retired just this summer, which also allowed us to have some time to record this podcast. And he began his academic career as a scholar of English literature. But while he was in Iceland in the 1990s, he met an Icelandic scholar, Karl Smári Herensson, who suggested they work together to translate a 17th century Icelandic document that chronicled the experience of Reverend Olafur Eglisson, a Lutheran pastor who was captured in a Barbary Coast corsair raid on Iceland in the summer of 1627. This translation has been published as The Travels of Olafur Eglisson, the story of the Barbary corsair raid on Iceland in 1627. After working on this translation, Adam switched his academic focus from literature to history, specifically, indeed, the history of the Barbary Corsairs in the 17th century, a subject he finds perennially fascinating and one that he feels has more relevance to today's world than most people expect. He and Karl have written 6 more books on the Tarih-i Sahir, as the Icelanders refer to the corsair raids of 1627. 2 of them have French translations as well. So Adam's latest book is Corsairs and Captives, a title that shares with his blog, Narratives from the Age of Barbary Pirates, which is an anthology of captivity narratives dating from the 16th to 19th centuries. So after this very brief presentation, I would like to ask Adam. Adam, so the topic of today is Murat Reis, with whom I share my name, and which can be either translated as ambition or willpower. So Adam, how can we situate the life of Jan Janszoon within the greater historical context of the 17th century? Please.
Well, first, thank you for that very kind introduction. And I have to say, I was thrilled to get an email from somebody called Murat. Murat Reis in English would basically be Captain Ambition, which was, I think, a very good name for Murat Reis. He started life as a Dutch privateer. His Dutch name was Jan Janszoon, Jan Janszoon. But he wasn't just an individual functioning like a pirate. Privateers are essentially pirates in what they do, although they have a legal authorization from their government or monarch to attack enemy shipping. He wasn't just an individual, though. He was part of this much larger series of events. Specifically, in his case, something called the 80 Years' War. The Netherlands was a tiny little country, but they had big ambitions, and they had several unique qualities. They were the first genuine capitalist democracy, although we might not have recognized it as a democracy by today's standards, but by the standards of the late 1500s and early 1600s, they were remarkably egalitarian and remarkably capitalistic. And they decided they wanted to break away from the Spanish Habsburg Empire. They were part of it. They were a colony, so to speak. So they launched this war of independence. The Americans had their war of independence in the 18th century. The Dutch had theirs in the 16th century, the 1500s. But they were a little tiny country, and Spain was the world empire at the time. And they didn't have anywhere near the ships to confront the Spanish Navy head on. So they had to resort to privateers. It was a very common practice in those days. Privateers were authorized by the government. They had an official license. In Europe, it was frequently called a letter of marque that authorized them to attack and loot enemy ships. It specified what the enemy was. In this case, for the Dutch, it was the Spanish. They would pay up front. They would pay the expenses of getting the ship, of equipping it, of getting the crew, of going out, hunting down Spanish ships, attacking them and either sinking them after looting them or bringing them back. And then all the loot or ships they had got would be auctioned off back in the Netherlands. And then everybody took a cut. The government took their cut, the backers, the financial backers of the expedition took their cut, and the privateers took theirs. And this went on for 40 years. So a couple of generations of people grew up where this was the basic business enterprise for many families and businesses. And then everything changed. In 1609, there was a truce declared between the Spanish and the Dutch. And as a consequence of that, suddenly Dutch privateers were out of business. So a lot of them just went back to being ordinary merchant seamen and tried to take up their old lives again. But there were a lot of them, and there weren't really enough jobs to go around. So it was a big problem. And seeing this, what some of them decided to do was just stay out at sea and continue doing what they'd been doing. But now they'd lost their legal authorization. So they became pirates, outlaw pirates. And Jan was one of these. Jan Janszoon was one of these. And after, we don't know how many years, but there are references to him in Dutch texts saying clearly, very clearly, that he was a Dutch privateer attacking the Spanish. There's one reference that says he kind of got carried away even as a privateer and attacked and looted ships he wasn't supposed to. Which would be in keeping with somebody who decided that he was not going to go back to ordinary life, but instead was going to become a pirate.
Adam, if I may, what do we know about Jan Janszoon from Haarlem in the Netherlands during his childhood? What was his family background before he ever became a privateer?
Yeah, the short answer is nothing, but we can speculate. He was born in the early 1570s, and he was likely a young child during the siege of Haarlem. This War of Independence was ugly. It was violent and bloody, and a lot of the battles took place on Dutch soil. And one of those battles was the siege of Haarlem in the early 1570s. And Haarlem was surrounded and attacked. It took several months. It was winter time. There are some fabulous stories about this siege, one of which is that Haarlem was located right next to a lake, and the Spanish decided they were going to launch a surprise attack across the lake because the temperature had dropped and the lake was frozen. So the Spanish marshaled their forces and they tromped across the frozen surface of the lake. And it was very early in the day and it was misty. And suddenly, out of the mist, a bunch of Dutch musketeers on ice skates came zooming up and skated literally rings around these poor Spaniards who were slipping and sliding on the ice and just decimated them. And the Spanish retreated. Only in the Netherlands, right?
Yeah,
musketeers on ice skates.
The Dutch are always an ingenious nation. We can definitely say that. But probably Jan Janszoon, when he was a young man or even a child, he experienced this the force of the Empire of Spain firsthand, probably.
Yeah, he did, and probably he was very young, 2, 3, 4 years old. Haarlem was besieged and taken and occupied by Spanish forces. It was looted. A lot of the leaders of the town were publicly executed. It was an ugly time. And he would have grown up as a young child in Haarlem during the Spanish occupation, which probably did not dispose him well towards the Spaniards. And he grew up in Haarlem. Haarlem was not a seaport. The Corsairs didn't operate out of Haarlem. But he grew up as a young man and went to sea. A lot of the Dutch did. And we don't know whether he initially went to sea as a privateer or not, but he probably did. That was a way to make money because he had a young wife and he had kids. And he had 3 daughters that we know of with birth certificates for 3 of his daughters. The oldest of which was named Lisbeth, and we'll come back to Lisbeth much later in the story of Jan Janszoon and Murat Reis. So he was a young man, married, with a family to support, and probably a young man in that position, if he was ambitious, would go to sea as a privateer. That was a chance to make the best money. And my guess is what happened, he started out as a regular, decent young guy with a wife and a new baby and trying to support them and being very responsible and reliable. And then he got a taste of piracy. And either he just took to it naturally, or the resistance to violence that most human beings have can be worn down. And if you are exposed to a series of violent events, you get used to it. And one way or another, he became a ruthless pirate. So when he was faced with this decision, was he going to go back to his old life and become a merchant seaman or something else? Or was he going to continue as a pirate? He decided he would continue as a pirate. And so he relocated to La Rochelle on the Atlantic coast of France. And he operated as a pirate on La Rochelle. And we know that because of a letter written by the Dutch consul in Algiers saying that Jan Janszoon had been operating as a pirate out of La Rochelle. He'd been shipwrecked on Lanzarote, one of the Canary Islands, where in the summer of 1618, he'd been captured by an Algerine corsair expedition and brought to Algiers.
So just to clarify, he's not a privateer for the Dutch, for the Dutch Republic. He's an independent pirate, and he ends up at the Canary Islands. So he's already operating in this mid-eastern Atlantic area, rather close to Morocco.
Yes, yes. And we don't know exactly when he went to La Rochelle. Certainly it was after 1609. That was the date of the truce. We don't know how long he spent in Lanzarote. We don't even know if he was actually shipwrecked there. We only have one at the Kaiser's word for that. One of the interesting documents we do have is a warrant for his arrest issued by the Canary Island chapter of the Spanish Inquisition. And if it's okay with you, I'm going to read a little bit of that. It's a document held in the Museo Canario on Las Palmas in the Canary Islands. It's in Spanish. It's very difficult to decipher. I hired a friend of mine in Spain who is an expert on this stuff, and he does the transcriptions for me because I could never handle 17th century Spanish chicken scratches. They're really difficult to decipher. He does wonderful work. So, among other things, this document says, among those who were captured by the Moors and Turks, that is, by the Corsairs, who came to the island of Lanzarote in the year of 1618, one was Jan Janszoon, who, as is commonly known, lived on the said island of Lanzarote as a Catholic, and who, when he reached the city of Algiers, renounced our holy faith. And the warrant for his arrest was for apostasy, for renouncing the holy Catholic faith and becoming a Muslim. There's two aspects that are particularly interesting. One is that Jan's living as a Catholic, and the other that fact is commonly known. And that implies that he's a member of Lanzarote society. Everybody knows him. He's not hiding out anywhere. He's not a nobody. He's a somebody that is known. And he's been there a while. And he's a Catholic. And the records of the Canary Islands show that Dutch Protestants at this period, because remember, they'd been in a war with Spain and the Canary Islands were a Spanish possession. Dutch Protestants who were shipwrecked on any of the Canary Islands were in trouble. They were scooped up and interrogated by the Inquisition, often tortured. They were Protestants. That was even worse than being Dutch. And yet Jan is a Catholic, living amongst everybody as one of their own, basically. So my guess is that Jan was actually born a Catholic. Haarlem was the head of a Catholic diocese just before the War of Independence. There was a cathedral there. There's a fairly large Catholic population. It would be quite likely that Jan would be born a Catholic. And that would enable him to, if he was shipwrecked on Lanzarote, when he was scooped up and brought to the Inquisition, he could say, I'm a Catholic. And they could say, prove it. And he could. He could recite the catechism and do everything else that you have to do as a Catholic to demonstrate your faith. And as a Catholic, even as a Dutchman, they would allow him to live on a Lanzarote.
If I might interject, there are two things that I want to share with you. One of is Moors and Turks. So what is the difference in the Inquisition's eye between a Moor and a Turk? And the second question, as someone who has lived in Belgium for 11 years, the Flemish, of course, Dutch-speaking Belgians are of the Catholic faith. And in Turkey and in the Mediterranean, the Flemish pirates are infamous. Just as the Barbary Pirates are infamous in Europe. So maybe he was more Flemish than Dutch? Would we say that?
Like so many things, it's complicated. The distinction between Dutch and Flemish, particularly what that distinction would have been in the minds of people 400 years ago, it's not all that clear. It really isn't. They spoke the same language, or at least could understand each other. They shared a similar culture. I'm not sure people outside the Netherlands and the Spanish Netherlands really understood the difference between Dutch and Flemish. And Flemish got used as just a generic term for Dutchmen, just as Turks got used as a generic term for all Muslims by the Europeans. And it's hard to distinguish between Turks and Moors, but in general, what it seems to mean is Turks are Muslims from Ottoman Turkey and the lands dominated by Ottoman Turkey, and Moors are North Africans. That seems to be the general usage of the term, although it's sometimes confusing, and sometimes Turks is everybody, including North Africans, and sometimes the distinction is made. The Canary Islanders had a lot to do with Barbary Corsairs, and so they probably made finer distinctions than other people. Somebody in England would just refer to everybody as Turks. The Icelanders referred to everybody as Turks. Didn't matter where they came from.
It seems to me that Spain had their own fleet of privateers, and they somehow also used pirates, just like the Ottomans and the Dutch, for their own states' imperial ambitions. But could we say that Spain was using religion at that time for political and economic ends, in a sense? What do you think?
That is a very complicated question. And I think to answer it, we have to go back a long, long time. It used to be, you'll have to pardon me, this seems like it isn't relevant, but it is. It used to be that anthropologists, cultural anthropologists, divided human societies into four categories: hunting and gathering band level, tribal societies, chieftainships, and nation states. And the criteria used to determine whether a society fits into one or the other categories was institutionalized leadership roles. And hunting and gathering bands do not have institutionalized leadership roles. There's no chief. Nobody can give orders to anybody else. There's only charismatic leadership. They're always leaders, but it's personal. It's the qualities of the individual that makes them a leader in that particular context. If you're going out hunting mammoths, you need to be organized. And if one guy in the band is a better organizer than anybody else, he's going to do the organizing because they get more mammoth meat that way. But tribal societies do have institutionalized leadership roles, but the people filling those roles have authority but no power. A lot of the North American Indian tribes were tribal in that sense. The Iroquois, for instance, in the northeastern United States, they had war chiefs, and the war chief could call a war council, and he could say, "We're going to go to war with the French." But if the young men said, "We've done that, it didn't work out well, we don't want to do that anymore," there was nothing he could do. He didn't have any police force, he didn't have an army, he could not coerce them in any way, he had to convince them. They would listen to him because he had authority. He was the war chief, but he had no power. Chieftainships, you have institutionalized leadership roles that are hereditary, medieval Europe. And the people in those positions of power have authority and power. So medieval kings had their armies. And they said, "We're going to war." And if the young men said, "No, we're not," the king said, "Oh, yes, you are." And if they didn't want to do it, he'd get his soldiers to coerce them. He would have private armies, mercenaries or loyal followers or whatever. And in nation states, same thing. The institutionalized leadership roles have power and authority, but it's not inheritable. It's institutionalized. And the interesting thing about this is that you don't get what we think of as war, large-scale armies launching wars of conquest, until you get to chieftainships, agriculture. Chieftainships don't necessarily connect to agriculture, but agriculture has no band level social structures. And when you have agriculture, you always have institutionalized leadership roles with power and authority. And you have war, large scale conflict, and wars of conquest. And if you look at human history, ever since agriculture came into existence, it's been one series of wars of conquest after another. It's been powerful men trying to increase their power, increase their territory, whether it's warlords or kings or sultans, and they use any means possible. Whether you're Julius Caesar or Alexander the Great or Genghis Khan or Hitler, you use any means possible to achieve power, to hold power, and increase your power. That just seems to be the history of the human race post-agriculture. And it's that phrase, any means possible, that I think helps answer your question. about the Spanish using religion for political ends. Because if you look at it this way, what you have in Europe at this time is a bunch of warlords, essentially, duking it out for power and territory. And one of the things that made the Protestant Revolution so successful in Northern Europe was that it allowed first the German princes, then the Scandinavian princes, and so on, to declare the Catholic Church null and void and to confiscate all the Catholic property, thus increasing their wealth, which in turn increased their power and authority and territory. And so certainly the wars of religion were wars of faith, but they were also wars of power. The 30 Years' War was an ugly, long-lasting dispute over who got which territory and how much power did each warlord end up having. And so the Spanish were doing what everybody else was doing. They were just, for a while, more successful than anybody else. They were the first into the New World, the first to loot the New World of all the potential riches there. That gave them more power. They then started to try and take over the world, as every warlord does, for reasons that completely escape me. Who would want to take over the world? I mean, that's a ridiculous task.
We could argue that they did this with a certain Catholic zeal, that they were conquering lands and people in the name of Christ and the church. And this also relevant to our geography at the moment. Spain, the Iberian Peninsula, was reconquered through a kind of crusade, and the Inquisition follows up to that. So it seems that the Catholic religion has a very peculiar role in this whole history.
Certainly does. And the Inquisition got started in Spain. I mean, there was an Inquisition in Italy, but the Inquisition, as we think of it, got started in Spain as essentially the thought police. You know, Orwell's notion of the thought police, thought crime, that was their job. And in 1492, the final year when the Muslim Sultanate in Granada was overrun by Isabella and Ferdinand, that year they also evicted all the Jewish population of Spain, except for those who agreed to convert to Christianity. Conversos, they were called. But the Spanish authorities didn't trust that these conversions were genuine. And so they took an institution that already existed, the Inquisition, in a very minor way, and assigned to them the job of policing the thoughts of the conversos, of rooting out the heretics. And that was the origin of the Spanish Inquisition. And then decades, many years later, when the Moriscos, the remnants of the Muslim population of Spain, were forced to convert, the Inquisition got the job of policing their thoughts too. And so their job was to look at these new Christians and to figure out whether they were genuine in their professions of faith or not. And in order to do that, they were incredibly ruthless, employing torture and all the things that the Inquisition is famous or infamous for. But it got started. They were the thought police.
I can't help but remember that scene. No one expects the Spanish Inquisition. Yeah, we both know. Probably our younger viewers won't know it. But if I'm not mistaken, that's Monty Python. So let's get back to Murat Reis. Maybe he was born a Catholic. Maybe he had converted to Catholicism from Protestantism, from Lutheranism, or Calvinism for profit as well. But how come he is in an arrest warrant by the Spanish Inquisition on the Canary Islands? What is the role of the Spanish Inquisition within piracy, I wonder? And also, upon this topic, I want to touch on Süleyman Reis, if I understand correctly, another Dutch convert to Islam who supposedly kidnapped or captured Jan Janszoon and probably gave him some ideas about converting to Islam is not that bad for a privateer, perhaps.
Well, that's two questions, right? Why did they issue the arrest warrant for him, and who was Süleyman Reis? The arrest warrant, I think, was issued for him because they considered him one of their own. He had been incorporated into Catholic society on Lanzarote. He no doubt went to mass. He was known. He was one of the community. And so when he converted, he had betrayed his community, one of their own who had betrayed them. Therefore, they put out a warrant for his arrest. The Spanish Inquisition was involved in the whole conflict between North Africa and Europe. They are the thought police. So whenever an escaped slave returned, he wasn't just greeted with open arms. His family might have greeted him that way. But the first thing he had to do if he returned to a Catholic country was face the Inquisition. They wanted to know, had he converted? Was he still a good Catholic? And sometimes they were ruthless and nasty and burned people at the stake. Other times, they were quite lenient. It depended entirely on circumstances, because even the inquisitors understood that if you were a European, captured, taken to North Africa, sold into slavery, and told that if you converted, your life would be better. Even the Inquisition can understand when somebody said, look, I just made it for show. I never, in my heart, I was always a genuine Catholic. I just pretended to convert. Please, you've got to believe me. Even the Inquisitor could see that there was usually some truth in that. So they would often say, okay, say 10 Hail Marys and whack yourself with a stick 12 times and then go home. I mean, not literally that, but they would give him some kind of penance. Sometimes it was 6 months in a monastery, whatever. We have a story of one such guy. I don't know whether now is the time to tell the story. He was actually a crewman aboard one of Murat Reis' ships. A young man named Juan Rodelgo from La Mancha, Don Quixote's famous hometown.
What happened? How did the Catholic Jan Janszoon, who was probably going to church on the Canary Islands, became suddenly Murad Reis?
This brings us to Suleiman Reis, who was Ivan de Wienboer, Ivan the peat farmer. And he, same sort of thing. He had been a privateer. He'd been put out of work, and he ended up in North Africa. And he, in fact, ended up as the head of the Taifa, the sort of the ruling council of Corsair captives.
Yeah,
he was a somebody, and his reputation was that he liked to crew his ships with fellow Dutchmen. And he organized a giant expedition against the Canary Islands in the summer of 1618. They took well over 1,000 captives in total. And one of the people taken was Jan Janszoon. Now, we have a letter from an English merchant in Morocco, and we'll talk about this letter later, that says he was captured by Suleiman Reis. But I'm not convinced that he was. I'm guessing that he might have been scooped up along with everybody else, but that he immediately went to Suleiman Reis and said, hey, I'm a Dutchman. I'm one of you guys. I was a privateer. And they might have had connections. They might have had friends in common or captains they knew. They might even have served on the same ship at one point. They were part of the same team at one point. They were Dutch privateers. That was a brotherhood. So my guess is that Jan Janszoon went to Suleiman Reis and said, Ivan, haven't seen you in years. How you doing? And then when he came to Algiers, he converted in like 30 seconds. He was never sold as a slave. He never went through any of that. He just became a corsair. And to do that, you really had to convert. There were Dutch captains who didn't convert and managed to survive for years as corsair captains, but it was never that easy. He really had to convert. And so I reckon that he had a connection of some sort with Suleiman Reis. Suleiman Reis recognized him as a competent pirate, because not only did he take Jan Janszoon on, he made him one of his lieutenants. And eventually Suleiman Reis decided he'd had enough of going to sea, and he made Jan Janszoon a captain of his own ship. So clearly he trusted Jan, and it's hard to imagine, and that happened very quickly, within a year or two. And it's hard to imagine that he would have granted that much influence and power to a guy he didn't know. So my guess is that he knew Jan Janszoon, at least by reputation, possibly personally, possibly through a friend of a friend. He had connections. One way or another, Jan had connections to Suleiman Reis and used those connections to get a position of importance in the society of the Algerine Corsairs. This is one of the things that marks Jan. He finds patrons, and he moves up through in his career by finding more and more powerful patrons.
And if I understand correctly, we have the Dutch consul in Algiers accusing Murat Reis of torturing a captured seaman.
Yeah, Wynant de Keyser again, same guy, who says, I can quote from the letter, translated, of course. He says, and it's just one quick line in an otherwise long letter, that Murad Reis, Jan Janszoon, had captured a ship and deprived that ship of the guns and food and sails and loot, whatever he could get. Moreover, he tortured a member of the crew to death in order to get money that he was planning to sell in Salé. Two things about that, Jan was ruthless. This is a letter dated September 1619. So it's a year after Jan has been in Algiers, and already he's out there commanding a ship as a captain and torturing people to try and get information and money. This was standard operating procedure. The first thing that the Corsairs did after they'd captured a ship was interrogate the captives to find out if there's any hidden loot, to find out any information they needed. It's one of the first things they did in Iceland. So within a year of being in Algiers, Jan is captaining his own ship, interrogating captives, and, very interesting, he's planning on selling stuff in Salé. So he's already thinking about Salé a year after he's...
Before we go on to Salé, I just want to insert a quick question as well. It's quite interesting that there's a Dutch consul in Algiers. So this makes me think of this common enemy of Spain, like the NTR Dutch documentary docuseries of 4 episodes, Hatred Towards Spain. It seems that the Netherlands and the Protestant world in general at that time had a rather special relationship with the Ottoman Empire and the Muslim world. What do you think about that?
I reckon that special relationship was driven by economics. The Dutch were this amazing group of people. They were in a war with a massive empire. Not only were they holding their own, they were getting rich doing it. They were building massive quantities of ships. They were building the best ships. They were taking over from everybody else. Anybody who wanted to hire a ship to transport goods, if they could, they'd hire a Dutch ship. It was the cheapest prices, most reliable shipping. And the Dutch were expanding. They were in this war. They needed money. They needed commerce. And they expanded into the Mediterranean, along with the English. And of course, as soon as they did that, they encountered the Corsairs. And this was bad for business. So they had to try and reach some kind of arrangement with the Corsairs. And they did with the Ottoman Sultan. And they signed formal treaties with the Ottomans. And in theory, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, they were city-states connected to the Ottoman Empire. They were part of the Ottoman Empire. But they had a lot of autonomy, and they didn't always go along with whatever the Ottoman Sultan said they should do. So the Dutch then tried to make specific arrangements with Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and also with Salé in Morocco, although Salé was never connected to the Ottoman Empire. So it was driven, I think, by business. They were capitalists, they were merchants, they were traders. They wanted to trade in the Mediterranean. There was a lot of money to be made in the Mediterranean, but they had to deal with these pesky corsairs. And so they made arrangements, they signed treaties, and the treaties were always breaking down and things were always going wrong. And corsairs were attacking Dutch ships and Dutch ships were attacking corsair ships. And it was always messy and complicated and never simple. But I think their main motivation was economic more than anything else. And they had a common enemy in Spain. So that was very helpful. That was the enemy of my enemy is my friend. But I think that was more an excuse than a motivation. I think the motivation was economic, and then the enemy of my enemy was a convenient excuse for creating treaties. They did actually cooperate on some things, but as far as I can tell, they didn't cooperate on a lot. They just agreed not to attack each other. They never formed joint fleets to attack the Spanish.
Unlike the French and the Ottomans in the 16th century, perhaps. But we mentioned Salé, so this is outside of Ottoman lands. Perhaps Murad Reis wasn't that fond of the whole hierarchical arrangement of the days of Algiers, with the whole elite Janissary corps and their politics. So somehow he found himself in Morocco, in what is today Rabat, in Salé.
What happened was Suleiman Reis, his patron, as I said, Suleiman Reis decided he wanted to retire and give up pirating and settle down in Algiers in a mansion. That's where these guys lived. You know, they were very wealthy. They lived in these wonderful mansions. But it didn't work out, so he had to go back to sea, much to his disgust. He had to go back to pirating. And the fleet that he had taken up with him encountered, I think it was a fleet of ships returning from Newfoundland, filled with fish. And they ended up in a sea battle. And Suleiman Reis had both his legs blown off by a cannonball, and he was killed in the battle. And that meant that Murad Reis had lost his patron, and at that point he left Algiers. So I think possibly what you're saying played a role. He was certainly set up very comfortably in Algiers. There's a wonderful, bizarre story told by a Dutch carpenter who visited with him in Algiers when he was living there around 1620. And this Dutch carpenter, had just been part of a crew of a Dutch ship that was in Algiers as part of this whole process of making treaties and organizing things. And they hadn't been captured. He wasn't a prisoner, nothing. He was just there in Algiers. And the ship was anchored and the captain was doing whatever he was doing. And the Dutch carpenter was bored. So he was exploring Algiers. And he bumped into Jan Janszoon, who was from Haarlem, and this carpenter was from Haarlem. They didn't, as far as I know, they didn't know each other, but they were fellow countrymen, right? And so they started hanging out together. And they probably went to taverns. There were these taverns in the bagnios, the slave prisons, run by slaves. They probably went to a bagnio tavern and knocked back a few flagons of ale or wine. It's probably wine, not beer. And then eventually, Jan Janszoon tried to convert this carpenter. He said, you know, you should convert, and you can, you know, be a crew, you can be a carpenter on one of my ships. Everybody wants a carpenter on their ship, right? Carpenters are great. You can be a carpenter on my ship, and it's great. You'll earn as much in a month as a corsair. Just imagine that. You'll be a wealthy man. And this carpenter, we know this because this carpenter was giving. He was being interviewed for a court case in Haarlem about something else entirely, but it had to do with, you know, connecting people to people and who knew who, and it was like 20 years later. He's talking about stuff that happened when he was a young man, and he said at one point, I went to visit Murat Reis in his mansion. When I got there, he was still in bed, and I was ushered into his bedroom, and he was sitting up in bed having breakfast. And there on the wall was what looked like a wreath. And I said, yeah, and what's this thing on the wall? And he said, oh, that's a wreath of foreskins of people who have converted. It's nothing, it's just a little snip, and you'll get all this wonderful stuff in return.
That's quite the story. I remember that from the NTR documentary. But it is rather easy to convert to Islam. You just have to do the Shahada, and of course, circumcision is a proof of Muslim identity.
So Jan was well set up, but he left. The obvious reason is that his patron died, and therefore his connections were severed. And at that point, I think he made a calculation that he could stay on in Algiers, having lost his connections to the head of the Taifa, or he could head off to Salé. Clearly, he'd already had some connections with Salé from one at the Kaiser's letter, saying that he was going to take stuff from the ship and sell it in Salé. So he had some connections there. And Salé was this up-and-coming corsair capital. It was the corsair capital of the Atlantic. One of the things that happened, the Dutch privateers, once they were put out of work, a lot of them ended up in North African ports, the enemy of my enemy. And when they were there, they converted. It's the only way to go. And one of the things they did, a similar thing happened with the English, was teach the North Africans how to build, sail, navigate, and fight in European-style sailing ships. Before then, the North African corsairs had basically been using oared galleys, motorboats powered by human muscle, essentially. And they were very effective in the Mediterranean, but you couldn't take them out into the Atlantic. They couldn't manage the heaving waters of the open ocean, and they had to keep stopping to buy food and water. I mean, a big galley could have 200 slaves chained to the oars. That's a lot of food and water to keep them going. So they were pretty much useless out in the open water of the Atlantic Ocean. Once the North Africans had learned how to use European-style ships, they burst out of the Mediterranean and started raiding all up and down the Atlantic littoral of Europe. And the port was Salé. The Atlantic port was Salé. So it was the place to go. If you're not going to be in Algiers and you want to be involved in the cutting edge of the new developments, you want to go to Salé. And Jan would have been familiar with the Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean. The Dutch privateer, he would have been operating in the Atlantic. So it seems a natural choice. My patron's gone. Here's this place that's growing, that's ideally situated to become the corsair port of the Atlantic. I'm familiar with the Atlantic. There's all sorts of opportunities there. That's my next port of call.
So it's kind of like a pirate city, Salé, isn't it? It's where pirates meet.
It became a pirate city. It didn't start out that way. Salé has a long history. Goes back to the 12th century. And there was a sultan who decided he was going to turn it into his capital in the 1100s, a long time ago. And he started building this huge city. And he built a big wall to encircle it, and a fortress, a rabat, the fortresses that were fortresses and libraries and monasteries and all sorts of things combined that were scattered around on the fringes of the Dar al-Islam. So he built a rabat there, one of those forts, and he built this wall that would contain the city. And then he died. He also started a mosque. And he built the tower, the minaret, and he started building the mosque itself. It was going to be the biggest mosque in the world at the time. And then he died. And then the place fell into disrepair. Salé's on the, what's now called Rabat, is on the south shore of the river, the Bourg. And what is now called Salé was on the north shore. And Europeans refer to them both as Salé, Old Salé and New Salé. Old Salé on the north shore, New Salé on the south shore. Old Salé was a religious center full of holy men and schools, madrasas. And New Salé on the south bank was just a ruin. The Kasbah, the fortress, was pretty much intact. There were a few buildings around the outside of the wall, a couple of hundred people, maybe, not much more. And it was that way for centuries. And then in the beginning of the 17th century, Morocco was convulsed by this really ugly civil war. The old Sultan, who had been the victor of the Battle of the Three Kings, that famous battle that took place in Morocco, the young Portuguese king and Ahmed al-Mansur and another king. Al-Mansur was the only one who survived. And he was the Sultan of today, what we think of as Morocco, the whole place. His reign was very successful, very effective, very efficient. He was doing fine. And then he died of plague in 1603, I think it was. And he had 3 sons, and they couldn't agree on who was going to replace him. And they ended up fighting about it. And that fight tore Morocco apart completely, and it never recovered. And that Saidian dynasty then ended and was replaced by the Alawites, who still rule today. And from the death of Al Mansur onwards, it was just chaos, and they never managed to recover. Meanwhile, while this is all going on, in Spain in 1609, after they declared the truce with the Netherlands, so they didn't have to fight anymore, they took advantage of that truce to solve the Morisco problem. They came up with the final solution. Remember that phrase, right, from Nazi Germany? They came up with the final solution. Nazi Germany's solution was to just exterminate everybody. But the Spanish solution was to evict them from the country, ethnic cleansing. And so they rounded up all of the Moriscos, and the Moriscos were the ex-Muslim inhabitants of Al-Andalus, as it was known to them, who had been forced to convert to Christianity, had been policed by the Inquisition for a century or so. Many of them still were secret Muslims, despite the Inquisition, despite the persecution. They went through the motions of being Catholics, but were still secretly in their hearts, they had never converted. They're all rounded up, marched down to the coast, put aboard ships, made to pay for their own passage, and shipped off, most of them to North Africa. There was one group from a place called Hornacheros, close to the border with what today is Portugal. They were a particularly interesting bunch. There were about 3,000 of them, very tight-knit community. They had money. They were kind of mafioso. They had a reputation as counterfeiters. They used to rob people on the highway. Supposedly, there was a series of unmarked graves outside the town of people they'd robbed and murdered. They bribed the officials to let them carry guns. They were a cohesive unit. It didn't save them. They were evicted along with everybody else. But they managed to hold on to everybody else was stripped of their property, of their wealth. And if they couldn't carry it, it was gone. The Hornacheros managed, because of their previous bribery and influence, to hang on to their wealth and to move as a group. The Spanish took everybody's young kids because they could rear them as Catholics. 5, 6-year-old, that was about the oldest. Anybody younger than that, they just took. Then it happened with the Hornacheros too. So they had the young kids taken, and they were kicked out of the country. And they wound up in Morocco. A lot of the expulsados wound up in Algiers and various other places. The Hornacheros wound up in Morocco in the midst of this bloody civil war, which was so awful. One 18th century chronicler once wrote that the war was so bad, it would make the hair of a suckling infant turn white. That's how bad it was. So the Hornacheros show up and they don't know what to do. They don't know, they're looking to find a place to settle so they can recreate their town in Hornacho. So they can have a town to their own. They've got the experience to do that. They're a cohesive unit. There's 3,000 of them. They just need a place to settle. And they look around and they don't know, they need to ally with somebody, but they don't know who. And one of Al-Mansur's sons, Moulay Zidane, picks up on this. And one of the problems in a civil war like this is you don't know who to trust. Anybody who's part of the system could be a spy, could be in the pay of your brother. You just don't know. Whereas somebody who comes from outside is not likely to be a spy. They don't know anybody. So Moulay Zidane makes a deal with him. He says, okay, you need a place to stay. I need a port on the Atlantic that I can count on. I'll give you Salé on the South Bank. It's yours. You can settle there. That'll be your home. You have to swear loyalty to me and keep this port open for my use. And the Hornacheros have said, of course, you got a deal. This sounds great. So they marched down to Salé. According to one English observer, when they got there were lions denning in the Kasbah. It had been abandoned for so long. And, they were North African lions. Who knows if that's true? But according to one English observer, there were lions denning in the Kasbah. And so the Hornacheros had to evict the lions and spruce the place up. And they settled in and they took occupancy of the Kasbah.
They sound like they were armed.
Yes, they were. Yeah. And they were not supposed to be. They had bribed the Spanish authorities to allow them to keep their arms. The rest of the expulsados were not armed. They didn't have any money. They had everything stripped from them. But the hornacheros were this strange group that had managed to bribe their way along for a long time. And so they managed to keep their wealth, keep their arms, keep as many of their kids as they could, and move as a group. Everybody else, they were just straggling refugees. So they took over Salé. New Salé, as the Europeans refer to it, the town on the south bank, modern-day Rabat. But they were ambitious. And so they put the word out to other expulsados and said, come to Salé and settle here. It's a good place. So about 10,000 of them showed up. And there were these big city walls with nothing inside that had been built, back in the 12th century. And so the Andalusians, as they usually refer to, settled there outside the Kasbah. They built their own wall to enclose their own little town. And so at this point, and we're in the 16 teens, at this point, there's close to 15,000 Spanish expulsados living in Salé. But they need to figure out how they're going to live. What sort of a enterprise are they going to have here? There was cotton, there were salt flats. They could grow all sorts of food. But that wasn't enough. They wanted something more than that. And just about 50 kilometers north of Salé, there was a pirate port used by the English and by other European pirates. There were about 50 ships, a couple of thousand guys operating out of that port. It was a big port. And then one summer, while the pirates were off raiding wherever they were raiding, the Spanish launched an expedition and took it over and shut the place down. But they still, the corsairs and the pirates still needed a port on the Atlantic. And the hornacheros said, hey, we're open for business. And so a lot of the infrastructure, the merchants that had been taking the stolen goods, a lot of them from Livorno, they just moved their operation to Salé.
Again, this push and pull between Spain and the others. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And so Salé then grew as the corsair capital for the Atlantic, got bigger and bigger and more influential. But it was connected to Moulay Zidane because the hornacheros were loyal to him. At least they'd sworn an oath to him. So when Jan Janszoon, Murad Reis, showed up in Salé, it was boomtown. It was growing. It was getting wealthier and wealthier and more important. He showed up in the very early 1620s, maybe 21, 22, something like that. It was only in Algiers for 3 or 4 years at most. And he started operating out of Salé. By this time, he's really good at piracy. And he's immediately noticed. And the thing that makes his career in Salé is that he gets connected to Moulay Zidane. And Moulay Zidane makes him harbor master. There's a letter in this wonderful, astonishing collection of documents created by a French nobleman in the 19th century called Les Sources inédites de l'histoire du Maroc, unpublished sources of Moroccan history. Henri de Castries was the guy. It's wonderful. Everything that anybody ever wrote about Morocco is in those books. He hired people to go to every library and every archive in Europe, troll through everything, find every single reference to Morocco, translate the things that needed to be translated, all in French. And then he collected this multi-volume encyclopedia of Morocco. Just fantastic.
You have to admire 19th century French intellectuals. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. The work they did, the man hours involved, unbelievable. So there's a letter in there that talks about how Murad Reis was granted la généralité de la navigation. In other words, he was head of the shipping process. He was essentially the harbor master. It's often said he was admiral of Salé. Mm-hmm. And the Europeans at the time referred to him as the Admiral of Salé, but he wasn't an admiral in the naval sense. He wasn't out there as the head of a bunch of ships organizing sea battles. He was harbor master. He got a cut of everything. And no Salé corsair went out unless they had a letter of authorization from him, for which they paid. Everything that got brought into Salé was taxed, and he got a portion of the tax. So not only was he a very influential man, he became a very wealthy man, thanks to the patronage of Moulay Zidane. So he was a somebody fairly quickly, and he kept that position all the time that he was in Salé.
But it sounds like life was good for him in Salé, that he wasn't really going out to sea that much, I understand. So what changed that he took this fantastic travel to the extreme corner of the Atlantic, to Iceland?
Well, it was a combination of circumstances. The Hornacheros were theoretically loyal to Moulay Zidane, but they were ambitious, and they wanted to create an autonomous community. So they rebelled against Moulay Zidane and declared their independence. This was May of 1627. And that created a problem for Murad Reis and for every other corsair captain in Salé. The Salé corsairs didn't hunt in the Mediterranean. They hunted in the Atlantic. And a lot of the Salé corsairs became specialized predators, and they hunted the English Channel. And their preferred prey were English fishing ships. The English had a huge fishing fleet off the Grand Banks of Newfoundland and in Iceland. Hundreds of ships, 150 ships alone in Iceland in the summer of 1627. So there were a lot of these ships passing back and forth through the English Channel, going out and coming back. And the Salé corsairs specialized in preying on these ships. They weren't armed, they had no cannon. They had crews of about a dozen or so. They were easy to capture, perfectly safe. So they specialized preying on English shipping and anybody else they could find in the English Channel. But in the summer of 1627, an envoy from the English king showed up in Salé to try and create some kind of a treaty between England and Morocco. His name was John Harrison. What he discovered, of course, that all of a sudden he wasn't treating with the Moroccan Sultan Moulay Zidane. He was dealing with the Hornacheros because they declared their independence. So the very first official act of the new ruling council, the Hornachero ruling council in Salé, was to sign a peace treaty with England. It had to be ratified by the English king, so it was only provisional. But there was a peace treaty signed in the late spring of 1627. That created a problem. That meant they couldn't prey on English ships because that would blow the treaty. So what were they going to do? Nobody could prey on English shipping. They would all have to prey on the Spanish. And that meant that there'd be less for each of them. You know, there's only a limited number of Spanish ships they can attack. And if there's more of them attacking them, they're each going to get less. Looks like it's going to be a bad summer. And they had to make this decision very quickly because the corsairing season starts around April or May. And all of a sudden in May, as they're about to leave, they're told, sorry, chaps, you can't attack the English anymore. What are we going to do? And there's an Icelandic story that says two Turkish commanders, that's the phrase in the Icelandic document, but they weren't Turkish, not in our sense of the word. They were corsair captains. And one of them had to have been Murad Reis. And the other was a guy named Murat Flamenco from Antwerp. Murat Reis, corsair captains often operated together as teams. And there was a lot of coming and going between Algiers and Salé. And Murat Flamenco was one of the foremost corsair captains of his day. And so the Icelandic document tells the story of these two captains sitting down. And my guess is it was in a tavern in Salé, knocking back flagons of wine, complaining that they can't attack the English anymore. And the way I imagine it is, you know, Murat Reis knocks back some wine and says, "This is crazy. We can't attack the English. What are we going to do? What are they going to tell us next? We're not going to be able to attack the Spanish? This is crazy." Murat Flamenco then says, "Well, you know, I've heard about this place called Iceland out in the North Atlantic. Maybe we should go out there. Nobody's ever been there. They're not going to be expecting us." And Murat Reis says, "Are you crazy? You can't even get a stone out of that place. Never mind enough captives to make it profitable." That's actually a line in the Icelandic document. Can't get a stone out of that place. At which point, Murat Flamenco says, "You want to bet?" And according to the Icelandic document, it was a bet. And then a Danish slave who had been to Iceland, knew the waters, sauntered up to the table and very respectfully said, "Excuse me, noble sirs, captains, I've sailed to Iceland. I could take you there. I know how to do that. If you grant me my freedom, I'll navigate for you and take you to Iceland." And it was that chance combination of circumstances, the signing of the treaty, John Harrison being there, the two corsair captains drinking in a tavern, having a bet, the Danish slaves showing up suddenly. They have the means to get there. It was that combination of circumstances, I think, that prompted them to make a voyage of several thousand kilometers into, for them, totally unknown waters. It was a real risk.
If I understand correctly, the main booty for these pirates is human beings. Is that correct?
Yes, and that brings us to the topic of slavery. And that's a very complicated topic. Most people today, particularly in America and in Europe, when they think of slavery, they think of the African slave trade. And they think that that's it. That's what slavery was. But in fact, slavery has been around.
As long as the agriculture, perhaps.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. You don't need slaves if you're a hunting and gathering people. You just do the stuff yourself, you know. But if you're an agricultural people and you have vast fields that need tilling, you need workers. And slave workers, that's something that a lot of people relied on. So slavery has been around ever since agriculture has been around, basically. It was universally part of the classical world, ancient Greece, Rome, Persia, India, everywhere. The slaves were universal. It was an institution. And when Islam emerged, the world in which it emerged, slavery was an institution. And so Islam was just part of that world. And slavery became part of the Islamic world. The Quran and the Hadiths have a lot of stuff devoted to how you should treat your slaves properly. Treat them well. Don't give them too much work. Don't give them work they're not capable of doing. Don't beat them. It's a noble thing to give them their freedom. There is a lot of stuff about treat your slaves well. Be decent.
Of course, slavery is also codified in the Old Testament.
It's everywhere. And it's arguable that in theory, slavery under a Muslim regime is less harsh than under other regimes. It's better to be a slave in Baghdad than a slave in Rome or in Athens or other places. Definitely, it's better to be a slave almost anywhere than in a North American cotton plantation. But slavery is still slavery, right? Everybody does it. And the other thing is Islam has rules. And there are rules about how you can and cannot enslave people legally. And one of the rules is you cannot enslave a Muslim. You can buy a Muslim slave, but you can't enslave a Muslim. And so where do you get your slaves from? And the only licit way to get a slave is in a just war, something that's sanctioned under Sharia law. The only way to legally get slaves is in a just war. You take the captives from your defeated enemy and you sell them into slavery. That's it. That's the rules. Europeans had no such rules. They just did whatever they wanted. They often they were captives, but they had no such rules. So in 1492, when the Sultanate of Granada was overrun and the Muslim population of Spain was either evicted or forced to convert, those who had been evicted wound up in North Africa, furiously angry. Their homeland had been taken from them. And then to add insult to injury, the Spanish decided to take the fight to the enemy, and they invaded North Africa. And they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and worked their way eastwards across the North African Mediterranean coast, taking one place after another after another. It was an invasion. It was something that rattled North Africa. And it was a classic example of holy war. You needed to defend the Dar al-Islam. And so this was jihad in a really fundamental sense. And that meant that any captives taken in this war could be legitimately sold as slaves. And corsairing, as we know, it got started in this period. And it was initially sort of a haphazard process of trying to get revenge, of trying to defend the Dar al-Islam, of doing anything they could to try and turn the tables here, to shift the balance and push the Spaniards back. But after a while, people began to realize there's a lot of money to be made in this stuff, that human trafficking was profitable. And the North African city-states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, and Salé, they ended up being economically dependent on the proceeds of corsairing. So it started out, it really seems, as a holy war, a righteous response to Spanish aggression. In modern times, we would see it as what's called blowback. And there's an eerie echo to modern developments. There is this quote attributed to Mark Twain that history doesn't replicate itself necessarily, but it rhymes. And this is one of those eerie rhymes. That the Spanish, the way they phrased it was they had to take the fight to the enemy to protect the homeland, which was exactly the sort of phrases used by the Bush administration after 9/11. And they took the fight to the enemy in Afghanistan, in Iraq. And the end result was blowback, Al-Qaeda and ISIS. ISIS was arguably created by these invasions, and Al-Qaeda was strengthened. And so the same sort of thing happened. The Spanish did their version of that. They took the fight to the enemy to protect the homeland, and they created blowback. And the blowback in their case was the Barbary Coast. And initially it was a holy war, as I say, but then it became a large-scale business enterprise. And the holy war aspect was always there, but it really looks like it became secondary. And that what took precedence was the business enterprise. And with all businesses, you need to grow. You need to increase your profits. And so it grew and grew and grew. And they were taking thousands of captives a year. And there was this whole infrastructure. Everybody was in on it. It was one of the major economic drivers of all those corsair ports. The government got a share. The tavern keepers got their share. The tailors, the grocers, all the people in the markets, everybody shared in the wealth. So when a corsair expedition returned to a place like Algiers, if they were successful, they'd sail into the harbor and fire off their cannons. You know, it's a successful expedition. And people would flock to the harbor. There'd be hundreds of people cheering and eager, and women would dance on the roofs of the houses because they wouldn't be out in the streets. But the women would dance on the roofs of the houses and singing and waving their arms, because all of a sudden all this wealth was coming into the city, and they were all going to be able to get their share.
Wealth in the form of human beings that were in turn sold in the slave markets in exchange for mainly gold, if I have said correctly.
Well, all sorts of things. Wealth in the form of human beings that were sold in the slave markets, sometimes for ready cash, sometimes for barter that could be exchanged for various things, and loot as well, booty, whatever the ships that they had captured happened to be carrying. So it wasn't just people, it was also loot. And it was legal under Sharia law because this was holy war, this was the enemy, it was the Dar al-Harb, the house of war, specific rules applied. So it was perfectly legal within the Sharia framework of the law. But that whole aspect, the holy war aspect, it really seems as if it took second place, and that the business enterprise became primary. Follow the money, right?
Just as in the case of the Spanish Inquisition and how Spain used religion, it was primarily for actually business. and money. But let's get back to Iceland. So what does these Turkish raids have a place in Icelandic memory or in Nordic memory in general? What is the wildest fiction that you've encountered in your research concerning these Turkish raids?
I don't know about wild, but there's a lot of fundamental misunderstanding about what happened. The basic story, if you Google the attack on Iceland, the basic story is that Murad Reis led this attack and they took 800 people captive. That story is wrong on every count. The story is they attacked Reykjavik. Reykjavik didn't exist as a town until the 18th century. It was a farm. They didn't attack Reykjavik. That comes from an account written by a guy called Vreeman, a Dutch writer in the 1930s, who wrote that Murad Reis had attacked Grindavik, and then in brackets, Reykjavik. He thought Grindavik was another word for Reykjavik, which was the only town he'd ever heard of in Iceland, no doubt. And then there was this guy called Philip Goss, who wrote a book on the history of piracy. And he perpetuated that. He said Murad Reis had attacked Reykjavik. And that became the standard story. So if you look up stuff on the internet, that's the story you often hear. Murad Reis attacked Reykjavik and captured 800 people. It's not what happened at all. There were two captains, the story of the bet. And Murat Reis attacked Grindavik on the southwest coast of Iceland in a place called Bessastaðir, which was the home of the Danish governor. Iceland was a Danish possession. And he attacked some English fishing ships, part of the English fishing fleet in Icelandic waters, and that was it. And Murat Flamenco, the other captain, attacked the East Fjords, southeast Iceland, and the island of Heimaey off the south coast. So the details are not well known at all. And my Icelandic colleague, Karl Smári Hansen, and I have been writing books about this stuff to try and get the details straight so that those old stories get replaced by more accurate versions. The interesting thing about the Icelandic attacks is that it's the best documented corsair land raid there is. The Icelanders have always been a very literate people. One Icelandic scholar said, hardly had the sails of the corsair ships dipped below the horizon than the Icelanders started scribbling furiously about what had happened. And it's true.
But indeed, care to share some of the Icelandic source excerpts that you find particularly interesting, perhaps?
Yes. I've got 3 different sources here. There was a report written about a month after the raid based on eyewitness testimony. So this isn't hearsay, this isn't rumor. This is a local sheriff who interviewed people who had managed to escape capture. So here's a description from this report. In many places, women lay dead, some stabbed, some cut into pieces in front of their farmhouse doors, left there so disgracefully that their clothes were hauled up to their necks, so they were nakedly revealed where they should not be, something that completely offended the Icelanders. One man was in his bed ill. The pirates struck him so many times that his bedclothes became red with blood. They set fire to the farmhouses. There was a woman there who could not walk, who they captured very easily. Her, they threw on the fire, along with her 2-year-old baby. When she and the poor child screamed and called to God for help, the wicked Turks bellowed with laughter. They stuck both child and mother with the sharp points of their spears, forcing them back into the fire, and even stabbed fiercely at the poor burning bodies. And the thing about this is, when you think about it, it doesn't really make sense, because the whole point is to take captives alive. So every potential captive you kill, you lose money. But there's a certain dynamic to a corsair raid. You want to terrify the people you're about to capture. One of the ways to do that is to do terrible things to a few of them. to terrify the rest.
Kind of psychological warfare.
Yes, yes. And so a lot of the violence that did happen was done on purpose to terrify people. So that if you watch them do something like this and they come after you, you're going to go, okay, but don't throw me into a fire and stick me with spears. So that's part of it. There's also another really interesting aspect to this. There's a letter written by an Icelandic sheriff talking about the attacks. And he says this: the corsairs ran as fast as good horses, going up cliffs and rocks as cats might, so that nothing could stand against them. They carried bottles along with small cups, which they poured into from the bottles, and this they drank when they intended to commit evil acts. Men think these bottles contained human blood mixed with gunpowder and other substances to strengthen their cruelty and their bloodthirstiness. I reckon there's not much chance the corsairs had bottles filled with human blood and gunpowder and who knows what else. But I don't think it's unlikely that they had bottles full of alcohol. This opens up a whole new possibility for corsair attacks, that something like the woman being thrown in the fire and stabbed with the spears isn't fueled by sadism and isn't done as an object lesson to terrify other people. It's done because they're drunk and getting carried away and egging each other on. Because if you're a corsair, that's a dangerous job. You leap aboard on this strange place, you don't know what you're facing. And a lot of these people must have been very scared. They're just people. A lot of them were young guys. Here they are in Iceland, a place they've never been before, a very weird place. They don't know what they're going to encounter. For all they know, they might turn a corner and there'll be an army charging down on them. They have no idea. So what do you do if you're scared and you've got to do this? Take a drink. Take another drink. Do it with your buddies. Share a drink with your buddies. People have been doing this ever since there've been warfare and alcohol, right? You're in a trench in World War I, you've got to go over the top. Well, have a stiff drink first. I'm not quite sure what to make of this. I don't know if it can be used as evidence that this was standard practice for Barbary corsairs.
But also we have to underline that here the crew, most of the crew of Murat Reis at least, were also European renegades, weren't they?
Yeah.
So in a sense, they were doing this to their own, almost their neighbors. So this Icelandic raid is really peculiar because it's so far away, but the tides turn and Murad Reis's crew can and do attack the English coast, don't they? The most famous of which is the Baltimore raid, if I understand correctly, which is still very well remembered in Ireland. Care to share how this shift takes place?
Well, this takes us back to the treaty signed with the English. It was taken to the English king, and the English king refused to ratify it because he said the Hornacheros were rebelling against their rightful monarch, and he refused to deal with rebels. So the treaty never came to anything. So the next summer, 1628, the Salé corsairs were back to raiding the English Channel again. It was just that one summer of 1627 when the English were off limits. They were used to the English Channel. They'd been up there for decades. They'd been preying on English shipping and anybody else they could find. And there's, in fact, a story that the island of Lundy in the Channel, the western part of England, was a corsair base. And I've never been quite sure how seriously to take that. I'm not sure if it's practical for them to actually have a base there, but they certainly could have used it. They could have used it as a place to shelter, to drop anchor, to congregate, to put, they sail up the Atlantic, and then they congregate at Lundy and come together and then launch attacks. They could have used it that way. But they were up there a lot. It was a big problem for the English and the French and the Dutch. And then in the summer of 1631, we have this attack you were talking about, a place called Baltimore, south coast of Ireland. And one of the things we have is a report handed in to the English government, written just a few weeks after the raid. And it gives the details of what happened. On June 17th, 1631, Captain Matthew Reis, that's how the English refer to Murad Reis, Matthew Reis, a Dutch renegado, a Dutch renegade, had two ships, one of 300 tons, one of 100 tons. The 300-ton ship had 200 men as a crew. The 100-ton had an 80-man crew. 300-ton ship had 24 cannons. The 100-ton ship had 12 cannons. I mean, this is detailed stuff. This is not hearsay or rumor. So they captured various ships and did various things. And then they captured somebody who said, just like the Danish slave, if you give me my freedom, I'll navigate for you and I'll take you into the harbor of Baltimore that's undefended, and you'll get lots of captives there. This guy was a Catholic, and the settlers in Baltimore were Protestant settlers that had been moved in by the English. So it's this religious thing again as well. So here's the description of what happened. Reaching Baltimore at night, the captain, 10 Turks, and this Christian captive, the Catholic, Edward Follett, his name was, rowed in with oars wrapped in oakum for silence, so they didn't make any noise. And they walked around the town. Everybody's asleep and they're creeping around the town. But Follett explained the lie of the land to them and told them where the ablest men had their abodes. And in this business, they spent several hours. Then they went back to the ship. So it's the dead of night. A small party has crept into the village. They have this guy who's telling them, this guy over here is a blacksmith. He's really strong. Make sure you whack him hard first or he's going to be trouble for you. So they get all this sorted out. About 2 o'clock in the morning, the Corsairs silently landed 230 musketeers with torches to burn the houses and iron bars to break them apart. They divided into parties and surprised 26 houses in the part of the town they call the Cove, down by the shore. They carried 100 people of all ages out of their beds, killing several. They then proceeded to attack the upper part of the town, and guided by this guy, they broke open 40 houses, rifled 37, and captured 10 inhabitants. Then the drum was beaten, the local town drum. The town was aroused, so they had to retire. So it wasn't a heroic daytime attack. It was a sneak attack in the middle of the night. And they got over 100 people. And we have a letter from the English consul in Algiers at the time, marking the arrival of these captives from Baltimore, mostly women and children. We also have Father Pierre Dain, who wrote a very well-known book called Histoire de Barbarie, the history of the Barbary. He mentions them. Pierre Dain's take on it is that watching all these women and children sold into slavery, there wasn't a dry eye in the place. It was all so heartbreaking. And one issue that is obvious here is that if Murad Reis was operating out of Salé, why did he bring these captives to Algiers? The common story is that he had shifted operations to Algiers and was now operating out of Algiers, but that doesn't seem to be the case. He was still the harbor master of Salé at this point. But the reason is that the history of Salé as an independent republic under the Hornacheros is a turbulent one. The Hornacheros and the Andalusians are constantly in conflict with each other. The 10,000 expulsados that the Hornacheros invited in to create a much bigger town in Salé. They're constantly in conflict with each other. And the town across the river, Old Salé, is in conflict with New Salé. And at this point, in the summer of 1631, there's a Muslim holy man called El Ayashi, who had been fighting against the Spanish. And he was, it's the usual story, right? It's a warlord trying to increase his territory. So the Hornacheros and El Ayashi are in a war. They're lobbing cannonballs at each other across the river. And El Ayashi has a bank of cannons aimed at the harbor.
Not good for business.
Not good for business. So Murat Reis is a very cautious commander. It's one of the few things we know about him. He's a very cautious commander. This is clear in the Iceland raid. So rather than risk running the gauntlet, so to speak, of El Ayashi's cannons, he took his Baltimore captives to Algiers, a place he'd operated out of before. He knew there was lots of traffic between Salé and Algiers, and he sold them there. By this point, though, it looks like Murad Reis is getting fed up with the Hornachero. There's a letter that he wrote upon his return from Iceland that we have, thanks to Henri de Cast and the book that I mentioned, Unpublished Sources of Moroccan History. Murat Reis was the harbor master, but he was a kind of unofficial representative of the Dutch government in Salé. And if they had a problem, if the Dutch had a problem, they would write Murat Reis and ask for help. And they had a problem with a ship that had been attacked by Salé Corsairs. They wanted to get the ship back. They wanted Murat Reis's help in doing this. So this is his reply to the States General, the ruling council of the Netherlands. And he starts the letter by saying, I got your letter. I just returned from an expedition at sea. This was the Iceland expedition. And then he adds, things are a little crazy here in Salé at the moment because the Hornacheros are rebelling against their rightful lord, Moulay Zidane. I have no idea where this is going to lead because he's stuck between the proverbial rock and a hard place. He is loyal to Moulay Zidane, but his livelihood depends on him being part of the Salé enterprise. Ultimately, he opts to stay as part of the Salé enterprise, and he continues as harbor master. But he's clearly torn, and Salé just gets crazier and crazier. And eventually it spins completely out of control, and the Saïdian dynasty just spins completely out of control, and Salé is taken over by the Alawites, and that's it. It ceases to be an independent republic. But it looks as if Murat Reis is getting fed up with Salé. And he's getting older by this point. He's in his 60s, something like that. To be a Corsair captain and to make it into your 60s is quite a feat. So it looks like he's thinking about other things to do. And instead of, he doesn't settle down in Algiers. What he does is he moves to a place called Oualidia. Moulay Zidane lost Salé, but he managed to keep a small harbor named Safi. And Oualidia is just a couple of hours, well, drive today, but, longer than a couple of hours walk north of Safi. Murat Reis ends up there, employed by one of the sons of Moulay Zidane, who's died by this point. So he's still serving the Saïdian sultans. He still has a patron. And it's telling that that's what he would end up doing. That this is a theme that runs through his life. Suleiman Reis, Moulay Zidane, the sons of Moulay Zidane. And he becomes governor of Oualidia. He's given a woman, part of the Saïdian royal lineage. He's given a wife. He's given a Berber tribe to command. He builds a fortress in Oualidia, and he's holding it for the Saïdian sultans. But by this point, he's also an elder statesman. And he works as a go-between for the Dutch and sometimes even the English. He knew John Harrison, the Englishman who was there negotiating the treaty. He was buddies with John Harrison. And John Harrison described him as a great friend to our nation. That is the English. So he winds up in Oualidia as governor of the town, but also as an elder statesman acting as a go-between particularly for the Dutch. The last reference to him that we have comes from the travel diary of a Dutch artist named Adrian Matham, who was part of an expedition to Morocco by a Dutch ambassador, to try and free Dutch slaves and to try and reaffirm a Dutch treaty with the Moroccan Sultan, one of the sons of Moulay Zidane. And one of the passengers aboard that ship was Jan Jansson's, Murat Reis' eldest daughter, Lisbeth. She's come to see her father, who she hasn't seen in who knows how long. Because remember, as a young man, Jan Janszoon, as he was in those days, was married. He was married to a woman called Suchin Kavez, had 3 children with her that we know of. Lisbeth was the eldest. We have no idea what his connection is with that Dutch family. We know that he's likely, if he's behaving the way corsairs behaved, and if he's behaving the way powerful Muslim men behaved in those days, he's likely to have had a stable of women. None of whom he married necessarily. You don't know, he might have, who knows. But he's likely to have had a stable of women and a slew of children. The only woman we know he married was this Saidian woman he was given as a wife when he became governor, Walidia. But if Lisbeth wants to see her dad, there's clearly some kind of connection there. It's not clear what it was, but there's some sort of connection.
The NTR documentary mentions him going back to the Netherlands, to possibly Haarlem,
Yes.
and
Yes.
maybe putting his pirate treasure, digging a hole and putting it in, and which is supposedly discovered in the 20th century. What do you think about all of this?
He made 2 trips back to the Netherlands, because there was a treaty between the Netherlands and Salé. So he could legally enter any port in the Netherlands without being arrested or bothered. And on one of these trips, ship he was on attacked what he thought was a merchant ship, but it turned out to be a Dunkirk privateer. You mentioned that the Spanish used privateers. One of their main ports was Dunkirk, which is now, but now, but in those days, it was part of the Spanish Netherlands. So they used it as a port. And Murat Reis had the bad fortune of attacking a ship that he thought was a merchant ship, and it turned out to be a Dunkerker. And so they ended up in this huge fight, and his ship was crippled, and he managed to get away barely intact and limped into the harbor. I actually forget which town it was.
There in Zealand, I think.
Could be. There were 2 different times that he wound up in the Netherlands, and both times it was because once of a storm, and once because his ship was wrecked, and he had to get in for repairs. But part of the story is that while they were docked, the families of the Dutch crew members on board showed up begging their husbands to come back to them, and they all refused. And even more than that, there were young men, Dutchmen on the docks, who joined the Corsairs, partly out of, we can stick it to the Spanish, because everybody really hated the Spanish, right? And partly because they could get rich. And it's possible at that point that Jan met his wife and daughters. We don't have any documentation that he actually did, but why wouldn't they come to see him? He's stuck there for weeks. Everybody knows he's there. Everybody knows who he is. Why wouldn't they go see him? But if they did, he certainly didn't stick around. Maybe he left them some money, possibly. But once he'd sorted out his own affairs, he returned to Salé both times. As for the treasure, everybody's always talking about pirate treasure. It's just such a wonderful fantasy, you know.
Yeah.
The Clout Compagne, same story. He was a Dutch privateer turned pirate, operated out of Algiers, never converted. He was one of the few that operated out of Algiers, didn't convert, got a pardon, came back to the Netherlands, settled down, retired, lived out the rest of his life comfortably. There's stories about him having buried treasure in a churchyard somewhere, and people digging up grave sites and rooting around in church basements. Nobody ever found anything that I know of.
I must discourage our viewers not to dig any church graveyards to find pirate treasure, of course.
Right.
Irresponsible.
Right.
So in Walidia, it seems like Murat Reis is having a good retirement almost. Does he end his career? What does Adrian Matham tell of?
Well, yeah, the last we know, the last document we have that I'm aware of that mentions him is this travel diary of Adrian Matham. At this point, Matham was an engraver, a well-known engraver. He was buddies with Hans Hals, the famous Dutch painter. At this point, he was 50 years old. So he'd been around, and he was part of the expedition. He was there to chronicle the expedition, to make drawings and sketches and paintings, so that they had a record of what happened. The Dutch ambassador was a guy called Anthony de Liedekerke. He was 53 at the time. Lisbeth Jansen was there. She was 31. So she wasn't a young girl by this point. I mean, she wasn't old, but she wasn't like a teenager or anything. She was 31. And her brother-in-law was there, a guy called Jacob Arison. Why he was there, we don't know. Probably just to accompany her, The implication is that she's not married or she's widowed and she needs a relative to accompany her to keep her safe, maybe. I don't know. So they arrive in Safi at the end of December 1640. They talk to the governor of Safi. They send a letter to Murad Reis in Uwalidia. They get a response, and Murad Reis comes down to Safi with 18 servants. I'll read you from part of one of Adrian Matham's journal entries. Jan Janszoon of Haarlem, accompanied by 18 servants, went part of the way from Uwalidia to meet his son-in-law. Lisbeth's brother-in-law had gone on ahead to try and connect with him. Murat Reis had come to meet him halfway, and then they returned to Safi. He then got in a boat that ferried him to the Dutch ship that was anchored some distance offshore. And in the boat, he sat comfortably in the boat on a rug and sat in pillows, his servants around him. So he's a wealthy guy. He doesn't just sit in the boat. He's got a rug, satin pillows, no doubt with tassels and embroidery, and he's got servants around him. This is a wealthy and important man. So he's doing all right. He was then led into the captain of the Lord Ambassador, where his daughter was waiting for him. When the father saw his daughter, they both burst into tears. Now, that's a very interesting observation. Here's this guy who tortures people to death, who has made his living for over 2 decades by capturing and selling human beings. This is a ruthless pirate, burst into tears when he sees his long-lost daughter. So they spend time together talking in the cabin, and then he returns to shore, and he invites Lisbeth to come and stay with him. But this is December the 30th when he comes out to see Lisbeth. The next day, on the 31st, she's on shore, has been there all day, and Adrian Matham observes, our men reported that they had noticed that Lisbeth Jans had her fill already of the people and the country, and that she consequently wished to be brought back on board the ship again. So at this point, Elizabeth is saying, I don't think I like this. I want to go back aboard the ship. But she gets taken to Lydia anyhow. And Adrian Mavin visits Lydia, hangs out with Jan Janszoon, does a drawing of the fortress for him. The ship is there for months. The Dutch ambassador goes to Marrakesh along with Murat Reis to try and free the Dutch captives, to negotiate renegotiate the peace treaty. Jan Janszoon, Murat Reis acts as the go-between, introduces the ambassador to the Sultan, does all this, takes weeks of travel, months. And finally, by August 1641, so they've been there 8 months, they leave. And on August the 22nd, we get this. The same day, Jacob Arison, Elizabeth's brother-in-law, came aboard again from Lydia, leaving Elizabeth to stay with her father. That's the last word we have on Jan Janszoon and Murat Reis. I personally think he kidnapped his daughter. That's the kind of thing he would do. Hey, my daughter, I want you to live with me. But Daddy, I don't want to. Tough. You're going to stay. But that's the last we hear. Whether she stayed willingly or not is not clear. Whether she ever returned to the Netherlands is not clear. Jan Janszoon's end is not clear. All we know is that he was wealthy, respected, doing fine, an important man, facilitating contacts at the highest level between the Netherlands and what remained of the Saadian Sultanate. By this point, he's probably in his 70s, if not close to it. That's old for a pirate in those days. So the chances are he didn't live a great deal longer. He might have. He could have been one of those rare human beings that just seemed indestructible, and he might have lived into his 90s. I spent another 20 years there. But if he did, he would have run into problems because the Alawites would have taken over. And it's not like he lived that long anyhow. So probably he had a pleasant retirement as an elder statesman, lots of money, lots of luxury, with his daughter to attend him, maybe. And with this young wife, no doubt she was young, given to him by the Saadian sultans. And that's it. He's one of those rare pirate captains that had a boisterous life and managed to survive it and get wealthy and settle down and have a pleasant retirement. Crime doesn't pay, they say. Well, in his case, it seems that crime did pay.
It does seem to be that throughout history, crime and criminals have lived rather well, unfortunately. But so we don't have a tombstone or anything,
Nothing.
even though he was married to a very privileged family.
Yeah, nothing. Nothing about him, no birth certificate that anybody's been able to find so far. No portrait, no direct writing of anybody who knew him or served with him. Lots of references to him.
Indeed. He becomes a legend, even in America. Isn't that correct?
Well, that's another story. Anthony van Salé. And Anthony van Salé existed. There are lots of documents for him. He settled in New Amsterdam, the city that eventually became New York. He got in a lot of legal battles. He was a aggressive character. So there's lots of legal documents. He married a woman who it looks like was a barmaid / prostitute. Married her aboard ship just after leaving the Netherlands, and they settled in New Amsterdam. All of this is documented. He was there doing this stuff, definitely.
He was called Anthony the Turk, isn't that right?
He was referred to as Anthony the Turk, Anthony van Salé, also Anthony van Fez. He's known by both those names. But the story about Anthony van Salé is that he was the son of Murat Reis. There's no documentation for this. Zero. There's a whole industry that has been built up to prove that he was the son of Murat Reis. And there are biographies of Murat Reis that you can find online in which people say, and Murat Reis settled down in Spain in 1610, married a Morisco woman, and had several children, one of whom was Anthony, who was the eldest. But there's no documentation for this. And he would not have settled down in Spain in 1610 and married a Morisco woman because the Moriscos were all being kicked out of the country at the time.
But do you think Anthony van Salé encouraged perhaps this myth that he was the son of a famous pirate?
No, it came about much later, much later. It's a fantasy. What is true is that Anthony van Salé had 4 daughters, and prominent families are descended from those daughters, prominent American families. Humphrey Bogart supposedly is one of the descendants. Jacqueline Bouvier Onassis Kennedy is another one. The presenter on CNN, Anderson Cooper. But, the problem with that is that it's a fantasy. Everybody loves to have pirates in their ancestry and to be connected to important people. But it's all a fantasy, not documented by anything at all. And the notion of having a pirate ancestor is just so enthralling that people have run with it for a long time. It's been sort of the standard. It's the accepted thing. Yeah. Anthony van Salé is the son of Janszoon.
Many people in Turkey still claim to be descendants of Barbarossa, of course.
Right. Yeah, it's the same thing. It's all a fantasy.
But what do you think it's so fascinating about the character of Murat Reis that he's still being talked about almost 400 years after his passing? What do you think that captures the imagination of both Westerners and Easterners, of both the European and the Muslim world? What is so interesting about Murat Reis that we're still talking about him, making documentaries about him, writing books, recording podcasts about it?
I think the simple answer is he was a pirate, and everybody loves pirates. I mean, that's the simple answer. I think a slightly more complicated answer is that he was a liminal figure. He was both European and North African. He was both Christian, Catholic, and Muslim. He straddled 2 worlds. The things he did are so outrageous and so interesting. And the character that he was is so fascinating because he wasn't just a pirate. He was all these other things as well. And he's sort of a microcosm for the world in which he existed. The world 400 years ago was this crazy place. We're so used to having everything organized, boundaries. There are, every country in the world now has a border. You can see it on the map. It's all organized and arranged and done. 400 years ago, that wasn't the case. Now we can talk about Turkey, Bosnia. 400 years ago, it was all this amorphous place that was part of the Ottoman Empire, part of Europe. Same thing with languages. Now people speak English or French or Arabic or Turkish. Back in those days, people spoke whatever they needed to speak to converse. People say that English is now the lingua franca of the world, and it kind of is, but only by default. It's because it's got such a simple grammar, and the influence of English-speaking nations has been so important in recent centuries. But it's not a lingua franca in a linguistic sense. Lingua franca was a mangled mix of languages. Nobody cared. All they wanted to do was communicate. And so the barriers, the borders that we now take for granted didn't exist to the same extent. And in some places, it didn't exist at all. It was a much more amorphous, much more tangled, much more confusing world than ours is today. And Murat Reis is a perfect example. It's very hard to pin down what he is. He was a pirate, but he wasn't. He was a corsair, but he was also a privateer. He was a Muslim, but he was a Catholic. He was a pirate, but he was an elder statesman. He operated out of Europe, but also North Africa. He's this wonderfully liminal figure that really reflects the times in which he lived. A fascinating character. And I'm in the process of putting together a book-length biography on him. There he is. Yes, there's my guy. I reckon that's, nobody knows what he looked like, but he would have been that sort of person. You can tell from his expression there, right? Don't mess with me.
I've seen stuff. I've done stuff that I don't want to talk about.
Right.
He was Dutch, possibly a Catholic. He lived in Spanish territories. He lived in Moroccan territories, Ottoman territories. He went to Iceland. He raided Ireland, the coast of England. And just seems to me that he is a man of the world. He was a citizen of the world and a mafioso, an illegal, a criminal, but also legalized in certain parts. So he's this person of gray areas. He's not black and white. So even though for you, maybe he did not cry when he met his daughter Lisbeth in South, but maybe he did. Maybe he did torture, but he also felt kind of emotional when he met his firstborn daughter, if I understand correctly.
Yeah, I think that's human nature. In a movie or a novel, characters are simplified, exaggerated for dramatic effect. Human beings are often self-contradictory. And I think it would be quite in keeping for a man who is capable of torturing somebody to death to also burst into tears when he sees his daughter after many years. I think that's typical of human nature. So I'm convinced that he really did cry and give her a big hug and say, "Oh, it's so good to see you again." The same guy who tortured people to death.
Adam, you've been so generous with your time, and it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you and preparing this podcast. I hope that our viewers will enjoy watching and listening to this as much as I did preparing and hosting it. I want to ask you if you have any closing remarks that you would like to share, a couple of works on your past and current work that you would like to present to our viewers.
Well, first, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity to let me talk at great length about pirates.
It's my pleasure.
A subject I find fascinating. As for what I'm working on, as I say, I've been working on a biography of Jan Janszoon for years now, but it keeps being interrupted by other projects. The latest book I'm working on is a translation, an English translation of Pierre Dame's Histoire de Barbary.
Great one.
That's scheduled to be published next year. My deadline for submission is January 31st of 2026. So as soon as we're finished talking here, I'm going to have to get straight to work.
But it's a very important document, and I'm so excited that you're going to make it into an English translation. It will be invaluable for all the historians out there.
Yeah, I'm puzzled by the fact that nobody has done this before. Seems an obvious thing to do. Nobody's done it, so I'm going to do it.
Can't wait to see it being published, and perhaps we can talk more about Father Dan, the Trinitarian Order, and his history of the Barbary Corsairs, which I find also fascinating. And so thank you again, Adam, and thank you to all of you out there who has been watching us until the end or listening to us. I bid you and all of you a pleasant day or night, wherever you are.
Thanks again.